to Reel Film Snobs. Boy, do we have a great episode for you this week. I am pleased to have back with me once again distinguished professor of film studies at Oregon State University, Jon Lewis. Welcome to the show, Jon.
Thanks. Good seeing you, Angela.
Yeah, good seeing you again. I have to say that we're going to talk about your new book, which is The Godfather Part 2 from BFI, British Film Institute Classic Series. I am a proud owner of both Part 1 and Part 2, so your first book on The Godfather as well as this new one on Part 2. But I
Awesome.
have to read the quote on the back because I laughed pretty hard. Not because it's not all true about you, but I could be a little bit bragging myself saying, well, this was my mentor. This is the person I study with. Describes you here as Lewis, the preeminent historian of 1970s Hollywood, has written a hard-boiled guide to The Godfather Part 2 that is as gripping as the film. Now, there's the quote you want on the back of your book. That's a great quote. So,
Yeah,
preeminent
how
historian
nice.
of 1970s Hollywood. So, that I couldn't describe you better myself. So, I figured I'd just read from the back of the book. So, we're here to talk about your new book, which I finished recently, and we're going to talk about the movie, The Godfather Part 2. But I'm going to start off with a few questions about the book. So, did BFI approach you to write this because you wrote the first Godfather book, and how did that all come about?
Yeah, BFI has a list. If you know this series, there are, it's probably 50 or 60 of these books now. But they keep the list secret. And most of the time, I would say 80 or 90% of the books are solicited by the press. They ask who they want to write about it. I guess if you get lucky and you propose something and they really want it, and they know who you are, then maybe you get asked to do the book. But yeah, they just asked me to do it. I have a feeling Godfather 3 is not on the secret list, so
Yeah.
I think
So it
I
might be
think
the end of your Godfather books.
it is. It is. Yeah.
Well, so it's interesting the way you approach this because, obviously The Godfather 2 is an unusual sequel in that it's often regarded by a lot of folks, maybe not everyone, as in some ways better than the first film, and certainly one of the greatest American films of all time. So, how did you go into, writing about a book like this? What was your kind of process in terms of what themes you wanted to explore?
Well, when they asked me to do it, I am of the opinion it's better than the first one, and one of the rare sequels that's better than the original. I think Terminator 2 is better than Terminator 1. So there are some that are better.
There's a few. It's a handful. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I kind of, because it's both a prequel and a sequel rolled into one. Um, it's also probably the best prequel film ever. Um, I didn't actually know. I mean, I thought I'd write a lot more about Cuba than I did. I was sort of interested in this sort of moment where we get everything wrong in Latin America, and I thought, when I was thinking back on a movie that I hadn't seen probably in 10 or 15 years, I was thinking, well, I remember this whole Cuba thing being really big, and that Michael understands Cuba and nobody else understands Cuba. And that's still in it, and I still write about it. But I thought when I was structuring the book in my head that I would have this long thing about Castro. And I'm a huge fan, this maybe will turn off some of your listeners, but a huge fan of his book, Castro's book, History Will Absolve Me,
Mm.
which is his testimony before a Batista court before he's sent to jail for organizing the revolution, and before Castro's forces overtake Batista. And he gives this great speech, and at the very end he says, well, history will absolve me. And I always thought, okay, first of all, that's what a great thing to say to a court, like, I'm not only innocent, but history will absolve me.
Hmm.
But then I wonder really if it has absolved him, because he had
There's a
another
lot of
60 years of
Yeah,
history. So
it
anyway,
is interesting. When I rewatched the movie, I was surprised how much Cuba was in it, and
uh-huh.
I'd forgotten all of that. So it was interesting that you don't actually spend a lot of time about that in the book.
Yeah, but that was the original version of the book was oh, it's going to be all this stuff on Cuba. And then I watched the film again, and I thought, the only thing that made sense was something very much like a scene by scene reading of the
Hmm.
film. That the film was so brilliant and so unusually brilliant. There may be a handful of American films this good. And I thought, well, I'm just going to talk about how it goes from one scene to the next. And that's probably 80% of the book now.
You did pull out some themes, though. There's some thematic, and I especially liked how the section on it's a movie of meetings, because as I was watching it, and it had been several years since I'd watched the film, it kind of struck me like, oh, it's very interestingly staged. We go from a room to a room to a room. There's not a lot of, for a gangster movie, especially, there's not really much action. There's a lot of people sitting and talking in different spaces, and I hadn't, and then you really get into that in the book about how it's really which doesn't make it sound very sexy in a way, but they're
No,
fascinating conversations. But it really is. There's just a lot of meetings happening. Even when they're in Cuba, they're having meetings in every room. They're having at the hotel, and then in that one place they're at with the entertainment venue. So there's also just meetings happening everywhere in Cuba as well.
yeah. I mean, I think it's supposed to, it sort of brilliantly plays with the theme that Michael's really a businessman. That's the transition from Vito to him is a transition from anything that still resembled sort of family over business to something that was all about business. And what do businessmen do? They have meetings. And so
Yeah.
the film is really about just meetings. And I thought in some ways that made the film even more brilliant, because how do you make, if you break down the movie, it's like 15 meetings. And how is that interesting? You sort of ask yourself, how's that interesting? And the answer is, well, watch the movie and you'll see how that's interesting.
Yeah.
Um, every scene's just kind of brilliant.
Yeah, and the flashbacks, which often don't work in movies. I often find flashbacks are a device that is often poorly handled, are beautiful here, and you get into like some of the film, the cinematic ways that those kind of segues are handled throughout the book. I would imagine, though, it's interesting you brought up that you almost originally focused on Cuba. It's almost like you only have, it's a very thin book. I read it all in one weekend, so you can. You only have 90 pages to discuss this film that could have, just tons written about it and has. So you could have thematically gone anywhere. You could have, corporate America, family, the role of women. You get into that briefly at the end, especially, but there's so many things you could do. It seemed like going scene by scene in a way was the best way to do this concisely.
Yeah, and when you mention going scene by scene, the dissolve is the, I don't know, the sort of stroke of genius. Coppola had to make the movie this way, and I start the book talking about this, is that the studio didn't want Brando for Godfather 1. And then the concept that, oh no, we're gonna have to do Godfather 2 with more Brando. And then Brando turns down the Oscar in 73 for the 72 film, and has Sacheen Littlefeather accepted for him. The studio basically said that he's not in it, period.
Hmm.
That you can't conceive. And Coppola was trying not to direct the film anyway, and had offered to write the script, but to have Martin Scorsese direct it. And because he had seen Mean Streets, the film we're going to talk about next. And the studio said, yeah, we never heard of that guy, the Scorsese guy.
Yeah, right. They didn't
And
want him to
and
direct it, right?
so he sort of ended up doing it. And I think Coppola found the idea of doing both men at about the same age. So Vito and Michael caught in some ways at about the same moment in their lives. Um, and then how do you link it together? And the answer is, the dissolve. And the
Hmm.
dissolve is the work of genius in the film, because there are like 7 or 8 of them. And that's all. You were talking about cheesy devices. Dissolves are often kind of cheesy devices, but
Hmm.
wow, not in this movie.
No, he manages to do a lot of things that are often done poorly, a lot of flashbacks, a lot of people sitting in rooms having meetings, all the things that aren't really cinematic, and then makes it 3.5 hours of just absolutely riveting
Yeah.
footage. And Robert De Niro, of course, won an Oscar for supporting actor, but Pacino was nominated but did not win again. It was crazy. I was looking back. His run in this period is just one of the best runs any actor has ever had, with The Godfather, Serpico, Dog Day Afternoon, then The Godfather Part Two, just for those 4 films. He gets nominated every time, doesn't win until, do you know when? The
Yeah,
90s.
Scent of a Woman, which is such a
Scent of a
bad
Woman, which
movie.
isn't even a very good film, in my opinion. But then he finally
Yeah.
wins. Of course, years later, I think it's just sort of a, congratulatory, oh, we screwed up and probably should have given you an Oscar sometime for one of the brilliant films you made in the 70s. But
Yeah.
yeah, I think I really thought it was interesting at the end. You took on the roles of the women, and I wonder, you also talk about how your students perceive the film. And I thought that was really interesting because you and I have talked a lot about this, about how younger people today or students perceive films that we love from this period and or from any period, you know, how things change. So is that something that you find with your students that they really don't like about this film, is the fact
Oh,
that
I don't
women
think
are
they
kind of
don't
sidelined?
like it. No, I'm actually pleasantly surprised that they do like Godfather and Godfather 2. The thing that they don't seem to get right is that Michael is a monster.
Hmm.
You know, the point, you know, Coppola kind of doesn't understand why people don't understand that. You know, he kills, spoiler alert, you know, he kills his brother-in-law and his father's best friend at the end of Godfather 1, and then in Godfather 2 kills his own brother. Uh, he sends his wife packing really at the end of both movies. He tells her, you can't ask me any questions at the end of Godfather 1. And then at the end of Godfather 2, he again slams the door in her face, but this time
Right.
out of his life completely.
Well, and away
Um,
from her children too,
exactly.
which is pretty
You know,
horrific thing to do.
yeah, yeah. He tells her, you know what I'm capable of. He says this to her. And of course, she knows exactly what he's capable of, you know. And yet students at the end, yeah, but he's great. He wins, you know.
Right.
The
He's like
ends
he's the
justify
ruthless
the
corporate
means.
exec. It's the same thing with all these billionaires out there, right? Like people hate them, but then sort of idolize them at the same
Sure,
time,
yeah,
you know?
you know, I- I'm from a different era, but there isn't that much difference between him and Gordon Gekko. Gordon Gekko,
Wall Street.
yeah, the character in Wall Street, he says greed is good. And Oliver Stone was trying to show how terrible this is. And people watched the movie and they thought Gekko was the coolest guy. And
Hmm.
so Coppola makes this movie about this monster, Michael Corleone, and people watch the movie and they say, wow, he wins, you know, and he doesn't let stuff bother him, and um, he keeps his cool no matter what. Yeah, but he's a monster. He kills his brother. Isn't that like a terrible thing? You know,
Right.
and yeah, so
But they
they
admire
seem
him
to,
because he's successful and
yes.
he's always one step ahead. And I think people always want to think, oh, I'd be like that too if I was in this situation. I'd be one step ahead. You know, I would have seen it coming that this
Yeah,
guy
are you
was.
like that?
No, I don't. I'm just thinking that's
Oh,
what people are thinking as they're watching
yeah,
the
yeah.
movie. That's what gives them the satisfaction. You know, sometimes like I would also be smart like this character. I would have seen that this guy double crossed
Yeah, I
me, you
think the
know?
flip side is that they know they're not. So they kind
Hmm.
of dig it. It's sort of like, you know, I'm not James Bond, but I think what James Bond gets away with and what he does is kind of awesome. Um,
Right,
so Michael, you know, I couldn't do that,
right.
but that he does that, I'm so I think is, I'm not saying I think this, but unfortunately, a lot of viewers look at him and see him as a kind of role model or
Hmm. Well, and the one thing
ideal.
that's interesting about his character, and I know we have a couple more movies we need to talk about
Yeah.
here, but just to, the one thing that really struck me on this viewing, and you bring out in your book, is also that the Michael's character is not happy, and he's not enjoying his wealth. He's doing so much to hold on to his power and wealth, which he enjoys not at all. You think of a contrast to that in the movie like Wolf of Wall Street, which you reviewed with me, by the way, on this show many years
Is that
ago,
right?
but where very wealthy people doing horrible things, but he's enjoying his money. They're going out and living lavishly. You never see Michael have any joy in any of the creature comforts that he has.
No, and I think that's important too. He doesn't have the joy of family, and if you understand Coppola as a person at all, you realize that taking joy in your family is kind of a big thing for him.
Well, yeah, the
So
Coppola family's big deal.
yeah, yeah. So I think he sees Michael's failings there, and maybe doesn't understand why people don't recognize that you know, Michael, you know, he dresses in this austere fashion. He doesn't enjoy his wealth. When in Godfather 1, he goes to Las Vegas. Mo Green offers him prostitutes and chips to gamble with, and Michael's saying, like, what would I want that for? I just want your
Right,
casino.
right,
Um, you know, he's there to take things over. He's not there to have fun.
right.
Uh,
And that
yeah.
way he's not like our current corporate billionaires who want to be off in rockets going off to outer space or whatever, because he would just be like,
Yeah.
I can't see Michael bothering with any of that.
No, no,
So
no.
well, brilliant book. I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
Well,
Fast
thank you.
read. I highly recommend The Godfather Part 2, British BFI Film Classics. Rewatch the movie, read the book. And we're going to talk about a couple movies related to The Godfather Part 2 next. So we thought of this whole episode thematically. So, John, why don't you tell us about our next film?
Well, we're going to talk about Conversation, which was Coppola's film made between the two Godfathers. And the film is is maybe is one of the lucky breaks in the history of cinema, in that he made a movie about audio surveillance, really thinking about a film by Michelangelo Antonioni called Blow Up, which was about a photograph of a crime taken by accident that then becomes the sort of source of the drama in the film. So in this case, it's a sound recording made by a audio surveillance expert, played by Gene Hackman, who's just so great in the film. And right when after the film was made, but before pretty much anybody saw it, you have Watergate, and you have the Watergate tapes, the tapes made by Nixon, and then suddenly everybody's interested in audio surveillance. So the film appears prescient, but it was never really about politics. It was an homage to a film that Coppola and a whole bunch of us of that generation loved, Blow Up. And then the film went on to win the Grand Prize at Cannes, his first of 2 wins there. And it was part of a run of, I think, the greatest run in the history of American cinema. So Godfather 1, Conversation, Producing American Graffiti, Godfather 2, and then Apocalypse Now. You've got 5 years or 7 years from the first one in the history of American cinema, and no one did it better.
Yeah, and it's funny because Coppola went on to make, and you also have a book about Francis Ford Coppola. That's also a brilliant book, which I own, Whom God Wishes to Destroy, and it gets into a lot of the history of Coppola's career. Because of course, then he tanked later on, just completely, kind of lit a match to that career that you're talking about in the '70s. Eventually, but when
Yeah.
people want to know what's the big deal about Coppola, the '70s is one of the things you point to. It's not Peggy Sue Got Married. Not that there's anything wrong with that film, but that stretch you just mentioned. The God Conversation is actually one of my favorite films of all time. Believe it or
Oh,
not, I
wow.
own it. It was the first time I saw it. It just blew me away because of how prescient it seemed. Just an idea of surveillance in general, which is something we're still grappling with today. This is not a theme that it's not a dated film. When I watched it just this last week, I still was just like, holy crap, there's so much in this movie that you can still get out of it. Gene Hackman's performance, one of the great ones of his career, and apparently very unlike his actual personality, he plays this very kind of just quiet, introverted person, very paranoid. Reminded me of the Nirvana song, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean that they're not after you, which is
Yeah, that's
definitely
a William Burroughs line, actually.
right, which they took from Burroughs,
Yeah.
but it just reminded me of his character sums it up perfectly because he becomes involved in this, potential murder that he, hears during this recording of just a routine job that he's doing. And he has to try to figure out, am I going to try to intervene? But then the more he digs in, the more things start happening to him. And then he's wondering, am I being tapped? Am I being surveilled? And then he's already paranoid before that happens. He's a guy who literally doesn't give out his phone number. Nobody, even the woman he's dating, doesn't know anything about him. So there's just all this great stuff, and it's such a small little film compared to everything Coppola tried to do after, where he was just trying to do huge grandiose things like Apocalypse Now.
Yeah, I think what he gets right in that film is that he focuses on Harry Cole, the Gene Hackman character, and he doesn't have an ideology. He just simply is doing this job. And I think one of the questions that comes out in the Watergate era is, well, who's doing this kind of stuff? The guys who break into the Watergate Hotel, like, what exactly are they after? What do they want? And Coppola puts out I think, the terrifying idea that some of these people don't care about anything. All Harry Cole cares about is a good recording. Doesn't care who he's recording, doesn't care what it means, doesn't care what it does to people, at least till the end of the film, he doesn't. All he cares about is, can I hear what they're saying, and will I deliver for my client? And I think maybe that's a little bit of Michael Corleone there too, that it's just simply a matter of, this is the job I've chosen, or that has chosen me, or that I'm doing. And really my only other choice is, am I going to do this really well? And Harry Cole does it really well.
He's really good at his job. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's an end in itself. There's what is his name? Alan Garfield, who plays his nemesis, who's also a surveillance expert, and actually sort of screws with Harry's life at the end of the film. but he also really admires Harry because Harry lives in this sort of paranoid shell, um, and all he cares about is the fidelity of his recording, and doesn't really care about what the recordings mean. And Coppola's not necessarily a political filmmaker, but if you look at Godfather 2 and this one, he seems pretty astute about America in at the sort of tail end of the Vietnam era. I mean, he seems to understand it pretty well.
Well, and also, I mean, all of that is still relevant. There's, so much technology is driven by people that just want to do stuff without knowing what the consequences are. I just watched a documentary during COVID that was about, the surveillance, these surveillance companies that are trying to get cities to hook up more surveillance on their streets to, and they're linking it to crime to try to get neighborhoods
Yeah,
to do it. But a lot of it for them is just like selling their equipment so they can have cameras on every street corner so they can do this, so they can do that. And it's a specifically in this case about Baltimore, but it could be anywhere. And it reminded me
yeah,
when I was watching this movie about there's that scene where all the guys got together after they've gone to the conference. They go to a surveillance conference and then they're all partying back at Harry's business. And that's the one with the character you mentioned. But all those guys, all they're doing is talking about this piece of equipment and that piece of equipment. And you could try recording it with this. And it's just, that's all that they care about.
yeah. And I think that's
Yeah.
pretty astute and
Yeah.
pretty terrifying.
Yeah, it's a great film, very small film in between two masterpieces. And this one, I think also, I mean, I just think the conversation is great. So definitely recommend that one as well. And then I know our next film we're going to talk about is Mean Streets from 1973. And the reason we picked this one, which I did not know about until it's in your book, but you also mentioned it. So Martin Scorsese, made this film, and then that's what Coppola wanted him to direct Godfather Part Two. But like you said, the studio was like, we don't know who this guy is. He's unproven. There was no way they were going to do it. Mean Streets happens to be one of my favorite films. I think it's one of Scorsese's best films still to this day. Crazy that you can't find a really awesome box set of it anywhere because we were talking about that. It is on DVD, but it's not like a great edition. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
So, but Mean Streets is really more like Small Time Hoodlums. It's really like a world away from The Godfather in a way, with Harvey Keitel's character playing Charlie, who's kind of this small time hood who's trying to protect his crazy friend, played by Robert De Niro again, called Johnny Boy, who just gets into trouble constantly. Um, and he just can't rein him in. And it's really a lot about their friendship, but also this kind of dynamic of these guys who are kind of the small time hoods that are trying to work their way up through the system. Very uniquely 70s, also introduces us to Scorsese's obsession with the Rolling Stones, who are used to great effect in this movie. My favorite scene still to this day is the scene where Charlie's walking through the bar with the red
Oh,
lights
with
and
the red, it's
the
all in red light,
and it's
and
all
he
in red light and
dances
the
with
Stone song is
the
on and the
stripper.
camera
Yeah.
swaying with him. To me, it's one of the greatest scenes in film, period. Every time I see that scene, I'm just like, how did he think of this? He's following him. He's right behind his ear. He's like so close with the camera. It's just phenomenal movie.
Yeah, it's one of the great. I mean, we now know Scorsese because of all the moving camera sequences, but this is one of the early great moving camera sequences. Yeah, the story is that Coppola saw the film and just said, okay, well, this guy's great. He's a little bit, he was a little bit ahead of Scorsese. Scorsese breaks really in '76 with Taxi Driver. So Coppola by then has a a bunch of Oscars
Hmm.
and the Palme d'Or from Cannes. Um, and yeah, he doesn't want to direct Godfather 2 because he doesn't even want to make another studio film. And yeah, he
Coppola, you mean,
suggests,
doesn't want to make
yeah,
another
yeah.
studio film. Yeah. Hmm.
And they just say, we don't know who Scorsese is. And then Coppola lays down his demands for Godfather 2 and says, I want $1 million. And the studio didn't even flinch.
Hmm.
A little like Austin Powers asking for his $1 million. And then he says, I want Robert Evans out of the picture, who was head of production in Paramount. He didn't know this, but Charles Bluedorn wasn't too thrilled with Evans anymore anyway. So he said, yeah, sure, you could have that too. And then he said, I didn't want to name it Godfather 2. He didn't want to name it a sequel. It was like the sort of death of Michael Corleone or something like that. And the studio
Right.
said, no, you have to name it a sequel. And eventually they won on that one.
Yeah, he didn't want
But
some
yeah, I
coda
mean,
at
just
the end.
quickly,
Yeah.
because I see we're running out of time. I mean, Mean Streets it's almost like watching Scorsese in film school. This sort of prodigious talent making a film for so little money that nobody cares what he does. So he's just sort of doing everything that comes into his head. And so if you don't take the movie as a whole, but just take it as in pieces, it's one set piece after another of genius. It's just how, nobody at the studio is saying, yeah, you can't do that, or you shouldn't do that, or, the movie should tell a story and it should hold up. Yeah, nobody cares about any of that because it's too small. So you're just watching Scorsese flex his muscles before anybody knows who he is.
I
Um,
wonder where he got the money for the soundtrack though, because there's like one hit song after another in this movie. A
yeah,
lot of earlier music too, a lot of
I don't
60s
know.
music. Yeah.
Using source music in 1973 is different than now. American Graffiti, which is the same year, 73, is one of the first films to use, previously recorded music in a narrative context. And uh, and there they were using money, they were using music rather that the studio was sort of paying itself for. They owned the rights to it. I don't know how he did that. It probably wasn't that expensive in those days. These days, it's crazy expensive. You can't do it.
Oh yeah, no, I just hard to imagine a small production like this because there's so many
Yeah.
songs and yeah, it's a great film. I know we're running out of time, but I have to ask, as you said, some of your students don't love this movie. It's hard for me to imagine,
Yeah, they don't
but
like it at all.
they don't like it at all, unlike The
No,
Godfather. So why is that? Just not enough going on?
no, no. I think it's a little bit too experimental, and
Hmm.
I think it's just too close to home. I mean, what Michael's doing with his family is just, we can't imagine any of this, but we can imagine having a really annoying relative
Right?
and having
Like
to
Johnny
decide
Boy.
whether, yeah, Johnny Boy. And it's the old biblical question, am I my brother's keeper? And in the end, Charlie decides, yeah. But I think the film's sort of arguing the opposite. That no, at some
Yeah,
point,
like maybe you need to cut this guy out. Yeah,
yeah, you need to walk away. But I think people can identify with that. Everybody can
yeah,
identify with that. There's a friend or a relative in your life
right.
who's the cross you have to bear.
Hmm.
And at some
It's
point,
true.
you might have to walk away. Charlie won't, and he loses the restaurant. He loses his connection with his uncle, who's sort of bankrolling him.
Yeah.
Um,
His loyalty,
but
he's like the opposite of Michael in a way.
yes,
Because he's
yes, he
totally loyal
chooses
to his,
family over
yeah,
business.
completely loyal. Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah,
And then is ruined because of it. Yeah, it's a great film. I don't understand why anyone wouldn't love it, but I like the experimental side. So that's
yeah.
me. I love how freewheeling it feels. John, I wish we could talk for hours, but we can't. So thank you again for being on the show. It was an honor and a pleasure as always.
It's a
And,
pleasure for me. Anytime, anytime.
oh yeah, we'll definitely have you back. And as always, you can check out our reviews on YouTube and on our website. And we're on CC Media, Scan TV, Corvallis Access Media, KMUZ Radio, KMWV. Thank you very much. Thank you to the great Jon Lewis. Have a great day and great movies.
Thanks so much.